Hello, everyone. Welcome in. I'm Lori Tellerico. I'm the Adult Community Engagement Coordinator here at San Francisco Public Library. Thank you for joining us for today's program. Before we get started, here's just a few quick housekeeping items. This program is being recorded and will be available for later viewing on the library YouTube channel. We'll have time for audience questions later in the program. Please use the chat to post your questions. And library staff will be monitoring the chat and can assist you if needed. Before we begin our program, I'd like to pause and ask for your attention for a brief land acknowledgement. The San Francisco Public Library acknowledges that we occupy the unceded ancestral homeland of the Ramaytush Ohlone peoples, who are the original inhabitants of the San Francisco Peninsula. We recognize that we benefit from living and working on their traditional homeland. As uninvited guests, we affirm their sovereign rights as First Peoples and wish to pay our respects to the ancestors, elders, and relatives of the Ramaytush community. Today's program is part of our programming inspired by the book Orphan Bachelors by Fei Main Ing, which explores the lives and legacies of Chinese immigrants in America and looks at how policies like Chinese exclusion still affects families and communities today. Through programs like this, we're continuing that conversation by helping individuals and families reconnect with their own histories and ancestral roots. We're excited to explore how to uncover and reconnect with Chinese family histories using My China Roots. Our speaker today, Clotilde Yap, is the Global Collections Manager at My China Roots. Since 2017, she has been helping families from around the world trace their roots to China. During today's program, we'll learn how to use the My China Roots Library Edition database, which is available free for all San Francisco Public Library cardholders. We'll see how you can search through more than 8 million records of Chinese immigrant ancestors, including exclusion files, community directories, burial records, and traditional genealogy books. We'll also learn about helpful translation and transcription tools that make it possible to conduct meaningful research even without reading Chinese. If you'd like to explore the database yourself, you can access it through the San Francisco Public Library's website under Genealogy Resources by selecting My China Roots and logging in with your library card and PIN number. You can also visit any SFPL branch in person for full access. Please join me in giving a warm virtual welcome to Clotilde.
Thanks so much, Laurie, and thank you for inviting me to talk about this. Happy AMPI Heritage Month to everyone here. I'm really excited to be back at the SFPL for a little chat and talk about how to use this resource. Um, those who don't know me, I'm Clotilde. I am Chinese on my father's side. My great-grandfather originally came from China. He came from Fujian province, and he immigrated to Malaysia in the early 1900s. And 4 generations later, I was born in the UK, which is why I have this accent. I'm also half French, so growing up, I've always been exposed to many different cultures and family histories as a result. And this is also the reason why I'm so interested in helping others with their family history research. I think it's a really fun and cool, sometimes frustrating process to go through, but I think it's really worthwhile. As Laurie said, I've been working with families on their family history for almost 10 years now, mostly through the work of My China Roots. So as you'll see during my talk today, My China Roots is a database, a Chinese genealogy database, but we also operate as basically a custom research firm. So if people have burning questions that they cannot find the answers to themselves, we also have a team of people who can advise them and help them with their Chinese genealogy research. So welcome to everyone here. If you feel so inclined, please do introduce yourself briefly in the chat. Tell us where you're dialing in from, and if you have any burning questions about your family history, and we can circle back to them a bit later. So in terms of who this webinar is going to be for, this is for anyone who has some questions and is just generally curious about learning about their Chinese ancestors. Maybe you're only just starting to look for records. Maybe you've already been searching for records, but you're just not really sure what is next. Perhaps you are not able to read Chinese, this doesn't matter. It's still possible to do Chinese genealogy without knowing how to read or understand Chinese. And rest assured, you're not alone. So if any of these bullet points speak to you, then you're in the right place. First, a little introduction or overview about my China roots if you haven't come across the resource before. So it's a Chinese genealogy platform where you can find all sorts of archival materials, historical records about the Chinese diaspora. So what does this mean? This means we have historical collections from different countries and places where Chinese people have settled. So primarily, the bulk of our collections, our overseas collections, are from the US. So we, for example, will have Chinatown records or Chinese exclusion files, or let's say pictures of tombstones or passenger arrival lists of Chinese immigrants arriving into the US, for example. We do have some very interesting collections from other parts of the world. For example, we have various tombstone collections from Peru, from Indonesia and Singapore, because essentially over the last, even going up to 500 years, you have had Chinese people immigrating from China and settling in all of these different places. Um, we also have a very large collection of Chinese genealogy books, also known as jiapu. And these are the main resource that you're going to be looking at if you get to the point where you can track where your family is from in China. And if you can find your ancestral village, you can potentially find your family history book. In Chinese, these books are called jiapu or zupu, and you can see an image on my screen here. It's this sort of handwritten family tree looking document. So this is what we call the Holy Grail in Chinese genealogy. If you find your jiapu, you can potentially unlock a lot of history. So we have a bunch of these digitized on my China roots, and I'll show you very briefly how you can navigate these types of books. Great. So Laurie mentioned how you can access My China Roots for free from the San Francisco Public Library. Specifically, if you navigate to the genealogy resources section of the library and then scroll down to the letter M, then you will find My China Roots. If you don't happen to be anywhere near San Francisco and you don't have a library card, we are available at a bunch of other public libraries and even university libraries around the US. If you don't see your local library and potentially you would like your library to have this resource, then don't hesitate to shoot me a message. I'll provide my email a little bit later, or you can just go visit my China Roots and to get in touch with us there. Great. So let's get started. For those who are sort of quite new to Chinese genealogy and are wondering, what they should be looking for at the beginning, in many ways, the approach to doing Chinese genealogy at the start is very similar to other types of family history or for other cultures, right? You want to start by collecting names and places. So try to get the facts around the who and the where and eventually the when. Now, what is special about Chinese genealogy, however, is that very quickly you may realize that you face an obstacle, which is on the spelling of Chinese names. Now, the further back in time we go, the more we notice that the same individual, let's say a great-grandparent, may have spelled their name in 4 different ways on different documents. So which is the correct name? This is not really the question to ask. In fact, all of these names are correct. It's just that there was no standardized way of spelling the name at the time that they immigrated, most likely. So let's say you have a Chinese person who's arriving in San Francisco in the late 1800s. The immigration official doesn't understand Chinese, doesn't speak Cantonese, and they will just transcribe the name that they hear, however they hear it, in their native language, right? So this is why you end up with all kinds of funny spellings. And you also end up with some funny situations where, for example, the last name of a Chinese individual is traditionally mentioned at the start of your name. So when I introduce myself in Chinese, I always start by saying my last name, Yap. But in some cases, this was misinterpreted as the first name. So the first name then becomes the last name, and all the descendants of the family end up with a first name as the last name, for example. Then you also have the issue of paper names, which I'll come back to later. But during the Chinese exclusion, there was a loophole in the Chinese Exclusion Act, which basically meant that if you were directly related to a legally sort of settled Chinese American citizen, you could apply to enter the country. So a lot of people used this rule to claim that they were related to somebody who was already living in the US as their son, for example, but used completely fabricated identities or used the identity of someone else who actually had stayed in China, for example. So this makes researching ancestors quite challenging. You have to be aware of the context when you start this work. But my main tip that I always tell people when they're starting out is to try and collect the name or names of your relatives, ideally in Chinese characters. Um, so the Chinese characters help you disambiguate between different possible spellings. Um, if I, as an example, on this screenshot that I have here of a document, you see this individual's Romanized or anglicized name is Hom Len. Now, Hom Len in Chinese, you could technically spell in lots of different ways. So different Chinese characters, different spellings, different names. But the fact that um, yeah, and this is just by nature of the Chinese language. You have a lot of words that sound the same but mean completely different things. So if you know the Chinese characters for your ancestor's name, this can get you closer to identifying actual records of the person and getting closer to potentially finding their roots back in China. The other thing to ask yourself is, where are my Chinese ancestors actually from? So, what dialect do we speak? Do we know the area in China that we're from? We get a lot of people who contact us at My China Roots, for example, who say that their family was originally from Canton. What can we do for them? Now, Canton is huge. Canton could be Guangdong province, it could be the city of Guangzhou, but most people, um, at least a lot of the early Chinese American immigrants, um, would have left from the port of Canton. And when they were asked, where did you come from? They may have answered this question quite literally. Well, I directly came from the port of Canton, but in fact, they were from a town in the countryside, for example, in Huishan or Huiping, or any other of the Pearl River Delta regions that a lot of Chinese individuals originally came from. So you want to also be looking for materials that might mention the birthplace. Think, for example, a tombstone. This is a fantastic clue, like the one that you can see on my screen. Traditional Chinese, even Chinese overseas tombstones that you will find usually list the ancestral home of the individual. You might also have spare photographs or letters at home with a return address from a relative that maybe the relative was corresponding with back home. These are all great clues that you should try to track down and keep an eye on if you can. The other thing that I want to really emphasize for those who are just starting out is that conducting Chinese family history research is a bit different still from researching other ancestors from other cultures. And the main difference is in how you approach and how you will, and what type of materials and records you can find once you know where they're from in China. Now, for example, it's not possible generally to obtain a birth certificate, birth or access birth registers or marriage registers in China or household registration documents. Um, yeah, this is really not something that is very realistic if that's what you are hoping for. However, it can still be really rewarding to do this research, but you have to sort of change what your expectations might be. So when you are looking to learn about the stories of your family in China before they moved away, your question should revolve around what is the village? Where is the village that my family is from? This is really the key to finding lots of information and stories about your ancestors. And this is the bread and butter that we live off of at My China Roots. This is what we've been doing for many years, is helping people track down their village and see what is remaining of their stories, of their ancestry in the village itself. So, for example, um, in your ancestral village, maybe I can give a personal example. So I visited the village that my great grandfather came from in Fujian province in China on two occasions. And um, and when I went back, I was able to see lots of really tangible traces that my great grandfather had left behind or that he had experienced. For example, I met with some villagers there, some elders who remembered my great grandfather, who, by the way, I had never met before. I'd only seen him in photographs and heard all sorts of family lore about him. And when I was in the village, they showed me the house that he used to sleep in before he sort of fled and basically escaped to Singapore before arriving into Malaysia. They also showed me the temple where all of the yaps, so all of the members of the clan were commemorated. They showed me the ancestral graveyard where the earliest yaps who had arrived into the village were buried. They shared all kinds of stories with me about how my great grandfather had returned to the village as an older man and had donated money to them. Some of them remembered him. And I also saw church that he helped build. So later in life, he sent some money back. He was a Methodist. It's unclear to me exactly when he converted, but at some point he converted and was a Methodist, and his name was inscribed on the entrance uh, plaque outside of the church. And the fact that I was standing there reading his name on this plaque really still gives me chills to this. Um, but one of the things that I also found during my trip at the village was a family tree book. So there was an older grand uncle of mine. So he was more like a distant cousin of my great grandfather, but he had been updating the zupu, the family tree book, and asked me to fill in some gaps because they had lost touch with some of our relatives who had moved to Malaysia. And in the book that he had been annotating, or rather my father, was listed as the 21st generation. So they had managed to identify names of every generation of Yap going back for about 20 generations, with some gaps here and there, and it was just inscribed on some loose sheets of paper. But you have different villages may have they might have more money to spend, and they actually publish a proper book where they record every name of every individual from the family, including who their father was and who their father's father was. And sometimes you'll have extra information, such as biographies of more famous individuals, for example. So these are all of the types of things that you might find in your village. And traditionally, it's not super obvious to get to this point because China is a big place and you might not know right away from looking at the clues you've gathered where exactly your village. Even if you know a rough area, you might not know exactly where it is. Then let's assume you have found it. Then you would need to make contact with someone there, maybe plan a trip over there. So you have to buy a flight ticket, travel there. You probably need to speak Chinese to be able to speak to people on site to ask them, hey, do you know my great grandfather? Do you recognize this name? Is there a zupu? Is there a family tree book I can look at? So all of these steps make it not necessarily very accessible for everybody, which is also why we built the database. I mean, now through My China Roots, you can actually type in a name of an ancestor in Chinese, and it will search through all of our digitized family tree books. So technically, you could find your jiapu without needing to visit your village, without needing to travel over there, and unlock potentially many, many names and hundreds of years of history. So now my introduction is over. I can show you sort of how that looks and how you would go about using the resource. So have a let's say, an imaginary library user called Rich, who is based in California, and he knows the name of his great grandfather who came to the US, which is Sam Sing Wong. So, how would he go about using my China roots to uncover information? Sam Sing Wong. Just gonna switch tabs for a second. So, you are now looking at the homepage uh, of my China roots. So, when you log in through the library or from home, this is what you'll be able to see. If you've used ancestry.com, it's kind of similar. You can type in the name of an ancestor in English. You can add different kinds of filters and then search to see what comes up. If you're looking for something very specific, let's say you know your Chinese surname, you know where in China your family is from, you could go straight to looking for a jiapu and in there then searching for a name in Chinese. Or um, perhaps you're looking for something even more specific, like a death record. We also have this really cool collection of association and directory records from different parts of the world. For example, we have directories from Jamaica. We work with a lot of Chinese Jamaican families to trace their roots and other Caribbean families. So wherever you had Chinese communities, they would often come up with their own telephone directories or business directories because they like to keep in touch with each other or go to a Chinese dentist or see a Chinese doctor or go to see a Chinese tailor. This is what these directories are for, and they're wonderful because they're often bilingual, so both in Chinese and English, for example. So if you're just interested in browsing, I suggest you click through. But let's go back to my example. So Rich, who is looking for records of his great grandfather, Sam Sing Wong was his name. So I'm just going to click search to see what comes up. So I am getting over 7,000 results. Wow, that's a lot. Of course, they're not all going to be relevant, but you can see on the left-hand side that these are all of the types of categories of records that have been found for Samsung Wong. And this gives you an idea of roughly what is available. Um, you could even filter in more detail by, for example, a location that is mentioned on the record. Oh, maybe this person came via the Philippines. I want to see this. Or maybe this person was headed for Cuba. You could also filter by gender, by Chinese surname if it is known, or whether or not an image is available, for example. If you have a lot of information about this ancestor and you want to narrow your search, you could also add a lot more filters to your search. For example, you could filter by location. I just want to look at records in California, and I know he lived in California, so let's just narrow it down to here. I could add a gender, I could add birth information, death information. And sometimes, especially if you are dealing with an ancestor who had a very, let's say, mainstream name, let's say Jim Wong, and you're finding way too many results, then it may be helpful to look for a record to get to a record of him together with a relative. For example, if you know he was married to a lady called Lai Shi, then you could add her as a spouse here, add her name, and this will look for records of Jim Wong together with Lai Shi. Probably it will be a census record, but this is a little tip if you are really struggling to find anything about an ancestor. I can add all kinds of other filters like where did they move to or which port did they enter from or arrive at. Then I could add it here, say San Francisco or Seattle, um, for example. And of course, I could also filter by record type. But if you're just starting out, I really recommend starting broad and then narrowing your results further. The other reason why it's good to start broad is, do you remember how I mentioned how you can't really trust names when you're researching for a Chinese ancestor? So this is particularly the case because Sam Sing may have spelled his name many, many different ways. And And our database takes this into account. So we'll include variations of a name or partial matches for the name as well, just in case he may have gone by another name. Okay, so let's take a look at some of these materials. The first thing that I personally would look for if I'm just starting out are censuses. So we have a series of census collections available. Now I've filtered my results to only look at census records, and I'm going to click on this one to start with. So this is a record of Samsing Wong in the 1910 census. And the census is great because it gives you a snapshot of this person, where they were living at a very specific point in time. And in this particular case, this Samsing Wong was living, it seems, with lots of other Chinese men, partners. So I guess they were business partners, or maybe they were all on at their work site on that day in San Francisco. Now, for any record that you click on, you can click to view the image. At this point, you can zoom in and take a closer look at what is actually on the piece of paper. Not all of the information is going to be indexed, and sometimes not on the census specifically, but on other documents, you might find other clues written in the margins, or, for example, a Chinese signature on the second page of a passenger list. So I always recommend taking a look at the original file just to see if there are any extra clues there. So a census will usually tell you a few things. It will tell you under what name this person was registered at the time, where they were living, who they were living with. And depending on the census year, you might also find out when they arrived in the US. This is super useful if you're looking for a case file or an entry record for this person. It might also tell you, do they speak English? Do they know how to read or write? Do they own a television in the house? All of these kind of cool more contextual things that will just help you get a better picture of the person. Now, the other thing you might notice on any of these records that you find on My China Roots is some of the information here is hyperlinked. So if I click on the surname, which is spelled either Wong or Wom on this record, let me click on Wong and see what happens. So here it opens the Wong Chinese last name page on My China Roots, which essentially explains and gives you a bit of context about the surname. What is it? What are related surnames? And how would you spell it in Chinese? Now, this illustrates my earlier point where Wong, in fact, corresponds to one, two, three, four different potential Chinese surnames. Each of these is very different. Each of these has its own history. It's like if you had Smith, the surname Smith, but spelled with a Y, spelled with an I, spelled with an E. They all kind of sound similar, but they are not the same. Now, if I click on, let's say, the first one, which tells me this is the Wong that means yellow and that is present in these regions, I can dive deeper into the history of the surname, including its legendary origins. I can also see how many family tree books for this surname are on My China Roots. And I can also visualize where in China the Wongs of this clan originally come from, as well as how the surname has been adapted, uh, depending on the dialect that the person spoke, or depending on where in the world they ended up. So you really have a lot of variations. And this is why you may have noticed that even within the same family, you might end up with a very different spelling for your surname. So if you like, and if you don't know your Chinese surname, I recommend you navigate to the resources in the top tab here. You see there is an item called Chinese surnames. If you click on that, you can then search any surname you like, Li, for example. And this will tell you, present you with potential options. Okay, so going back to Samsung Wong. So I'm looking at census materials. What else can I find for him? So we also have things like immigration documents. Come back to this file in a second. Um, for example, we have all kinds of passenger lists where you see the individual, when the individual may have entered or re-entered the country. These passenger lists can show you who they were traveling with, where they were headed to, who was their contact person back in the old country, or for what reason they were traveling. So again, really recommend clicking on these documents and looking at the page after and before, because sometimes there are some extra clues. And um, Laurie mentioned, this book by Faye, this book talk that's going to be happening or has already happened. Um, anyway, that
It,
dives into the history of, yes.
it's already happened, but it
Okay,
is
okay,
recorded on YouTube.
amazing. Um, so yeah, so Facebook, which dives into the history of exclusion and its impact on individuals and families. So on this topic, you will see a lot of exclusion materials also on my China Roots. For those who, oops, I just put the same one again. Uh, let's look at this one, for example. So uh, while after the Chinese Exclusion Act was established, what it meant was essentially mostly Chinese people were not allowed to enter the US, but there were some exceptions. You were allowed only if you were a merchant, or let's say the wife of a merchant, or if you were a student, or if you were already legally residing there and were native born. If you were a teacher or say a preacher, then you would be allowed in. So as a result of this, any Chinese person who arrived at a US port had to have their papers checked. They had to make sure that they had the necessary authorizations to enter the country. Now, if they were coming to California, they probably would have stayed at Angel Island, where they would have been interrogated. Their papers would have been checked. And you can see in these registers, which on our database are called Chinese exclusion books, you'll see that a lot of these individuals were checked, and you can see under what status or under what class they claimed um, to enter. So Section 6 means you were exempt under Section 6. Um, the first individual was exempt, the others were native or laborers or merchants. And you can usually see the date on which they arrived and then the date on which they were then released. And sometimes you have whole month goes where they are essentially staying on this camp, being interrogated um, before being released, or in some cases denied. So these books are really fascinating. And if you find your ancestor, say, on a ship, I recommend checking to see if you can find their entry in these books and vice versa. So these books can also tell you when on which ship they would have arrived on. This is listed on the top. And of course, on the flip side to these things, you might also come across things like an exclusion case file for your ancestor. So what is an immigration or an exclusion case file? At the top here, I have an example. So right now I'm just looking at a whole variety of Samsung Wongs. I'm not sure which one is the correct one for Rich's family history. Um, but let me click on this first Samsung Wong case file just to give you an idea. Perhaps there are some people who've already been able to track down a case file for their ancestor, in which case, congratulations. So if you had someone in your family who entered the US at any point between the 1880s to the 1940s or so, you might find an exclusion case file for them. They're not 100% indexed. This is the challenge still. However, and some have been scanned, some have only been indexed. In any case, through my China Roots, you'll be able to see if there is an index in their name, and you will see the file number. With the file number, let's say if there was no image here, you would not be able to see a scan. That would mean you would need to apply directly with the National Archives. So in this case, for example, this record comes from the National Archives in Riverside, which is the LA branch. So you could contact NARA Riverside and say, hey, I need to obtain this file, which I believe is of my great grandparents, for example. And then they could locate it for you, and you could either go there in person or try to get a scan of the file yourself. But so what can you actually find in a case file? So every time a Chinese American person, even if they were just going on holiday, needed to leave the US, then come back, they would need to get authorization. They would need to make sure they had all the necessary paperwork. Um, so all of the paperwork and uh, the interviews, the authorizations that they would have needed to get are all saved in the case file, usually at the National Archives. So, for example, here we have a case file for Sam Sing Wong, and his case file is over 30 pages long. It's huge, but this is also quite typical for a case file because you will have things like um, a receipt for a certificate of identity, which has basic information about the individual, when they arrived, their signature, but you'll also have letters to and from the individual, um, from, for example, the inspector, the immigration inspector who was checking on their status. You'll also have transcripts of interviews that would have taken place between the individual and the inspector, and sometimes with witnesses as well. So I mentioned earlier, beginning of the webinar, the issue of paper sons, right? Which was actually quite common. You had a lot of people using the name of a cousin or the name of a relative and not going as themselves. And the authorities sort of caught wind of this and they started to interrogate people a lot more to see if their stories, added up. So they would ask them incredibly detailed questions about, well, what is the name of your mother? And do you know how many siblings your mother had? And where were they living? And can you describe the village that you grew up in back in China? And where exactly was this person living in relation to this person? It's crazy the amount of detail that you can find in some of these. Um, of course, it's very dark. This represents such a dark side of history. The yeah, and the trauma that gets handed on from being interrogated and being felt so unwelcome can still be felt in the next generations. But on the flip side, we have access to this kind of crazy source of information and snippet into the lives of these people through these case files. Um, this is just so an example, but there are many more out there. What else can you find in a case file? Sometimes you'll have families that are bunched together. If so you'll have the case files of several relatives grouped together. If the individual was working as a merchant, then you might have some information about their business. So how many shares they owned and who are their partners and when was the company started, for example. So these are really fascinating, and I really recommend looking into these materials if it's appropriate, if it applies to your family. Um, what else do I want to show you? So some things that are quite special about my China roots, and I realize I'm speeding up a bit because I want to leave enough time for questions. But one of the things that are quite unique about our platform is really how we try to gather different sources and different materials that are really spread out in different places. So, of course, we have indexes from the National Archives, but we also have a lot of community materials that you wouldn't find elsewhere. For example, um, business directories that I mentioned before, these Chinatown directories. And we have quite a lot for the Bay Area, for San Francisco and the Bay Area. This is a very old one, this first one. This is from the International Chinese Business Directory of the World. And you see how cool it is because it has the names of the businesses and the individuals in Chinese along with their Romanized name. So this can really help if you haven't got a Chinese name in Chinese characters to work with. Um, we also have, these are more recent, so these Chinese Directory of San Francisco and the East Bay. Again, they will have the address, they'll have the name in Chinese, um, and yeah, and this is still quite basic, doesn't have too much, but let me see if I can see, aha, here. We also have some student material. So Oops, let me click on this one. This is for Sam Wong, who was listed in the Handbook of Chinese Students in 1932. So Sam Wong would have studied at, where was he studying? He studied economics um, and was living in Stockton, California, and he was registered. He was a member of the Chinese Students Association. So he's listed in this directory, for example. So these are pretty cool. And the other types of materials that I just wanted to highlight were the tombstone and burial materials. So I'm just filtering now by birth, marriage, and death records, just to show you some examples. So recently, I mean, sometime last year, we partnered with a local San Francisco Chinatown organization, which is called the Hoi Sun Ning Young Cemetery Association. And they are responsible for managing one of the largest Hoi Sun. So Hoi Sun is a region back in China that a lot of Chinese Americans come from. And they manage this huge cemetery for people who are ancestrally from this place. And we partnered with them to make those collections searchable. For example, here you have a Sam Wong who's buried in this particular Chinese cemetery, and you can see a lot of information on this burial record. For example, names in Chinese, their birth and death date, where they were living, and their ancestral place recorded in Chinese, which you can then search for. Um, And I think we also have the tombstone for this individual. Let me see. We have lots of different tombstones for Sam Wong's, um, which I think must be this one, which is the same Chinese name. And again, I mean, for those who don't read Chinese, it might not look like it, but the tombstone has a lot of clues. It has the birthplace of the Sam Wong who's on this gravestone. Uh, which is a huge clue for people who just have a vague idea of where it might be. Um, so we try my China Roots to prioritize these types of materials that have both Chinese and English information because the Chinese information gets you closer to your ancestral village. And we always try to index this information, whether it's the name or the village. The other thing that we do, let me see here, for another one of these. So I don't know if any of you have actually been to Colma, um, in South San Francisco to these cemetery areas, but there are several very big Chinese cemetery regions, and it's quite a special place. We have a friend who has photographed a lot of tombstones for Find a Grave just for fun because he just really likes cemeteries. And he took me on a tour of those cemeteries one time, and it was absolutely fascinating. But anyway, so here's another tombstone of a Sam Wong. And what I wanted to illustrate was really how on my China roots, if there is a Chinese name on, say, a tombstone or any document, a signature, something like that, we'll automatically try and search for it in our database of Chinese family tree books. So you see this section at the bottom of the page. It shows you first similar records that have been found for this name. And then it also shows you that there have been 12 potential records found of Sam Wong in the family tree book collection. Now, if I click on this link, it will bring me to a page where, so you can see there are 12 results. Each of these is a different book. It's a list of books that essentially mention this name. Now, I know it's all in Chinese, but I haven't typed any Chinese. I'm just sort of looking right now. And what I would need to do next to filter these results is to check, okay, well, where are these books actually from? Let's say I know that the Sam Wong is from Guangdong province. So I'm going to filter the results by this area because ultimately you want to find the book for your family where it was originally from. And I can see there is one result in this Aishan family Wang Zupu. If I click examine matches, it will bring me to the pages where the name appears. This is quite a modern compilation of a family tree book. Let me see if it will load. Then I can show you what this looks like. So um, you can see that you have several columns and what appears to be lists, right? Let's imagine you don't know what it says on this page, but you can see that the name that we've been searching for Sam Wong or Samsung Wong is highlighted here. So this tells me that this is the match. Now, if I don't understand Chinese, I have this very handy little tool that if I can move my Zoom bar away, here we go. You see this button that says extract text in the corner of the page. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select it, which lets me then drag my mouse over this little paragraph that I have found for which mentions the name. And I'm going to click again the button, extract the selected area. And what this will do is it will identify the Chinese characters for me. And then I can click, give me a translation. So what does it say? It says, Gong second son of Chun Wei, father of Xianji and Xianzhong. So essentially, it's giving me the family tree. It's telling me this person was the second son of this person, and he fathered these two people. So now, technically, with these names, I could then go on to find Chun Wei, who is the father. I can copy paste these characters and continue searching for this individual. So we really designed the database for also for people who might not be able to read Chinese to make sense of it. Um, but these books, I want to emphasize, are super powerful precisely because they contain so many names and so many generations. And even if you don't read Chinese, you could ultimately extract 20 names of your direct lineage in one go just by using these tools and using the search feature. Zupus don't only contain family trees, by the way, they also usually have things like more detailed biographies. Let me just um, jump back to the front of the book. Sometimes you'll see there's a lot of very dense content. For example, about the history of how this family even arrived here in the first place, what their story is. And this is where I'm just trying to look for some more text. Here. Okay. And this is where the translation feature is really very powerful. Let me take a chunkier paragraph to show you. Um, I'm going to extract, get the Chinese characters, and then show the translation. So it tells me, okay, this first ancestor, his given name was this, his name was this, he was born in this year, etc., etc. So you can really get a lot of information from these books, which sometimes can go hundreds of years into the past, right? This is from the 12th century. Okay, so I think I've shown you in very broad brushstrokes what you can do with the database. The last little tool that I want to show you, again, this is for people who maybe um, don't know how to type in Chinese, or maybe they just don't have the keyboard for it. They don't have a Chinese keyboard, but they have maybe handwritten note from a family member or a tombstone picture, and they want to get the Chinese characters from this image. So what do you do in in that case? So we have a similar tool that is available under resources, which is called image to text, which lets you upload an image from your device. Let's say, I don't know, your uncle or something sends you a handwritten name of your grandfather and you want to look for it. So you upload it here. It will transcribe the characters for you so that you can then copy paste them into our database. Um, And you can do this with, yeah, all kinds of materials, really. So now if I go here, I'll make sure to extract the surname and paste it in the surname field. And this will then show me, oh yeah, we found a match for you for this particular Chinese name. Again, this is in a jiapu, which is a bit more traditional than the one I showed you just before. It's not listed by, it doesn't list every name one after the other. It shows you the names in a tree format. So there's a bit less information, but you can actually read it without understanding Chinese. Okay, so I've been talking for almost an hour, so I will now answer some questions, I think. Let me just go back to my slides quickly, and please also have my email address, which I will drop in the chat for anyone who has any follow-up questions that they want to ask. But yeah, I'll be happy to answer questions now.
So it looks like there was a question in the chat about the case file information. Is the case file information created from the person doing the search?
You mean am I understanding the question correctly? Is the question asking whether the scan was made by the person searching? In which case, not, I don't believe so. I mean, the National Archives do scan a certain number of their materials and make them available. So all we're doing is pointing you towards that document scanned by the archive. I mean, in some cases, they have volunteers who come in and who scan it, but usually not. And yeah, the quality of the indexes, so how much information has been extracted from the files and what you can actually see, for example, on my China roots, really depends on the National Archive branch, how much detail they went in when they created those indexes, and how much they may have decided to extract from the file. So I hope I understood your question correctly. Please jump in or add a note in the chat if I didn't.
Yes, that question
Um,
was from Donna. Donna, if that didn't answer your question, please ask some additional information in the chat.
cool.
And let's see. I have another question. Is a death record a more certain source than others?
Hmm. Hmm. Um, I think unfortunately no source is certain. Um, and yeah, that's because of various reasons, right? It's because of historical reasons, because of the Chinese exclusion. You had essentially people who, over their entire lifetime, may have operated either under a paper identity and thus falsified different levels of their own identity, whether it's their birth date, their name, their place of origin, and sometimes that also translates into um, any trace that you have of them. What I will say, though, however, is that tombstones sometimes help you disambiguate these things because it's rare that, for example, a paper name is listed. Well, not rare, but it's not like it's never happened. But for example, we've seen some cases where the tombstone shows the original name in Chinese of the individual next to their paper name. And that's because they probably thought, the immigration officials are not going to be checking this tombstone for the original Chinese name. And so they've sort of done the risky thing of exposing the original Chinese name there. And so in general, I would say I usually trust a tombstone more than, say, a passenger manifest. But in general, you have to take everything with a grain of salt. Um, that includes even the family tree books that I mentioned that you could find in China, which are wonderful. But if you go further back in time, they really tend to make your family history sound super grandiose, and they try to connect you to all these famous individuals which is not always historically accurate, right? Um, so yeah, sorry, I cannot answer this question, 100%, but it's a very interesting question.
Okay, and then I have another question. Will extract text work on the cursive Chinese script? I have a hard time with properly printed characters and data from family in script.
Yeah. So on handwritten things, it depends on how clear the handwriting is. It depends on the quality of the picture. You can, yeah, you have to try it out. Um, and the translation will usually tell you whether it makes any sense or not, whether it has correctly identified the characters. But for sure, with handwritten characters compared to printed script, the quality or rather the accuracy of the OCR is not as high. Um, but when you use the tool, we actually do offer different OCR softwares. So if it doesn't work very well with one of the softwares, you can actually flip the switch. There's like a little drop down. You can select and try a different one. If you really get stuck, or if there's a lot of materials that you want translated, you can always contact us, to help you make sense of it.
Okay, and it looks like Donna has clarified her question. She said
Okay.
you referred to the case file. What is the definition of case file?
Mhm. And case file comes in all kinds of shapes and sizes, but essentially it is a collection of materials collected about a person who is either a Chinese American citizen or being investigated as to whether they are um, allowed to remain in the US. So it will contain, for example, a copy of an application, of a certificate of identity, interrogation transcripts, information on their passage to China or their planned trip away from the US and returning back. So they look very different depending on what your ancestor was doing and how many times they were traveling. But essentially it's like the proof that your ancestor would have needed to provide to enter the country. I hope that answers your question.
And then Donna has an additional question. What is the source of the information in the database?
Yeah.
I'm guessing that the info in the database is based on info that people submitted and that the people working on the database are tying the info together with tools. So that's my
Mm.
guess and the reason for
So,
my question.
okay. The info in the database does not come from information that people submitted. We don't use anything that people search for. All of the data that you see comes from existing indexes. We've worked with libraries, we've worked with community organizations that have documents that we have then transcribed ourselves, sometimes manually. We have a team who do this. Um, or I don't know, like we've worked with like museums that have these historical lists or materials and documents. That's the source of the data. We never use any information. I see there's also a question from Andrew Lushu who says it seems some of the information comes from personal trees. This is definitely impossible because so there is also a family tree tool that is available on My China Roots, but not on the library edition. This is for privacy purposes. So for those who want to start out their family history and want to just collect whatever information they have about themselves, they can build a tree that is totally private to them and none of the data gets used anywhere else to to just gather and organize that information. And when our system notices that there is a match between a document that exists in the database and a profile that exists in a tree, then people get notified. We send a little email that says, "Hey, is this related to your family or not?" Hmm. Yeah. Thank you for checking, though. I understand it's a good question too. It's an important concern to have. Yeah. Okay. And I see there's one more question from Sharon. Sorry, Laurie, I'm totally jumping in. This is your job.
That's okay.
Can I start a search with my father-in-law who died in 1994 in San Francisco? I'm not sure we would have such recent death records, but if you have his name, you could try typing that in, or try to gather the names of his parents potentially. But it's worth a shot. Certainly, more recent materials from the 90s onwards, we have a bit less of because of, again, privacy purposes um and just yeah, access to the data is generally less yeah, less straightforward. Mm. But yeah, my suggestion then would be to try to search for his immediate relatives if that's possible. Um, yes. Rona asked, if you're reaching out to people to inquire if that's a match and the recipient says yes, then do you update your database with the recipient's info to expand the database? No, we do not actually. The only thing that happens is that whatever document that you found that confirms the only document that may have been suggested as a match and the recipient agrees, then that document is just saved to the recipient's tree. But then nothing happens to the information that is provided by the user on their tree. Um, we don't have an FAQ section, but if you have more questions like this, feel free to um, email me as well. I'll be happy to answer them. Hmm.
I think that was all the questions. Oh, there is a question. Is My China Roots based or in or near San Francisco?
Well, we're actually based all over the place. We have, let me see. Uh, we don't have anyone currently based in San Francisco, but actually, I mean, I'm dialing in from Switzerland today, and most of our team is based in China, but we have people in Seattle and Toronto who are working with us. So, but we do actually work with so San Francisco Public Library or other local institutions and come to California quite often, but we don't have an official office or presence in in San Francisco itself. I'm wondering why you're asking. Is it because you're organizing an event or you want to speak to someone face to face? Just curious. But yeah, most of the work we do is very remote because the families that we're working with as well are all over the world. We work with people in California as much as we do with people who are in Malaysia or Australia even or in the Caribbean. So yeah, the work that we do is quite international as well.
All right, I think those are all of our questions. I'd like to give a big thank you to Clotilde. Thank you for sharing all this information with us today. And thank you for
Very
all of
welcome.
our attendees. Um, we hope that you'll join us at some more library programs. And if you missed any part of this program, it will be recorded. It is recorded and will be posted on YouTube later this afternoon. All right.
Amazing. Thank you so much for hosting.
Thank you. Have a good day, everyone.
You too. Bye.
Bye.